Title: A millionaire sees his humble employee picking food from the trash. When he discovers the reason, he begins to cry. Thomas Grayson had everything a man could want. He was a millionaire many times over, the owner of Grayson Enterprises, and one of the most successful real estate moguls in the city. With towering buildings, sprawling estates, and investments all over the world, Thomas had earned his fortune through a combination of sharp business instincts, hard work, and a ruthless streak that allowed him to make tough decisions without blinking. He lived in a lavish penthouse atop a glittering skyscraper, a monument to his wealth and success. The penthouse boasted floor-to-ceiling windows, an infinity pool that overlooked the city, and every luxury imaginable. Thomas spent his days in high-powered meetings, networking with other elites, and signing deals that made him richer by the minute. People respected him, feared him, and envied his position in life. But for all the power and luxury he possessed, there was a certain emptiness in his life, a void that even the most expensive cars, exotic vacations, or fine wines couldn't fill. At Grayson Enterprises, Thomas was known as a demanding and sometimes cold boss. He expected results, and nothing less. Among his hundreds of employees, few ever caught his attention. That is, until one evening, after a long day of work, he happened to witness something that shook him to his core. It was late, well after the office had closed for the day, and Thomas had stayed behind to catch up on some paperwork. As he looked out from his office window, something unusual caught his eye in the alley behind the building. A lone figure, hunched over, appeared to be rummaging through a dumpster. Thomas squinted, trying to make out the face of the person, and to his surprise, he recognized him. It was James, one of the janitors who worked at Grayson Enterprises. James was an unassuming man, quiet and hardworking. He had worked for the company for years, always polite and respectful, but never someone who stood out in the grand scheme of things. Thomas couldn't believe what he was seeing. What was James doing, digging through the trash? Intrigued, Thomas watched as James carefully picked through discarded food containers, retrieving half-eaten sandwiches and bits of leftover fruit. The sight of it made Thomas feel a strange mix of emotions, curiosity, confusion, and, though he wouldn't admit it, a pang of pity. Why would one of his employees be scavenging for food like this? James had a job, didn't he? He earned a wage. Surely, he didn't need to stoop to such desperate measures. Something about the scene unsettled Thomas. He decided he had to know more. The following day, Thomas couldn't shake the image of James sifting through the garbage from his mind. His curiosity gnawed at him, and by the afternoon, he decided to call James into his office. He was determined to understand what was happening. When James entered the office, he looked as modest as always. His uniform was neat, and he carried himself with a quiet dignity that didn't match the desperate action Thomas had witnessed the night before. "James, have a seat," Thomas said, gesturing to the chair opposite his large mahogany desk. "I wanted to have a quick chat." James nodded, taking the seat cautiously, clearly unsure why the CEO of the entire company had summoned him. He folded his hands in his lap and waited. "I won't beat around the bush," Thomas began, leaning forward. "Last night, I happened to be working late, and I saw you outside, behind the building, going through the dumpster. Is everything all right?" James's eyes widened in surprise, and his face flushed with embarrassment. He fumbled for words, clearly caught off guard. I. It's nothing, Mr. Grayson. Just a personal matter. Thomas didn't let him off the hook that easily. It didn't look like nothing, James. You were picking food out of the trash. That's not something people do unless they're in trouble. If you're struggling, there are better ways to get help. James shifted uncomfortably in his seat. For a moment, Thomas thought he wouldn't answer, but then James let out a deep sigh and spoke quietly, "It's not for me, sir." This piqued Thomas's curiosity even more. Not for you? Who, then? James hesitated again, clearly battling with himself over whether or not to tell the truth. Finally, after a moment of silence, he said, "It's for my family, Mr. Grayson. My wife, she's very sick. And our medical bills, well, they've piled up. More than I can handle, even with this job. I've tried everything, sold what I could, cut back on everything else, but it's not enough. We're barely scraping by, and sometimes I don't have enough to buy food. But I can't let my kids go hungry." As James spoke, his voice trembled, but he never broke down. There was a quiet strength in him that impressed Thomas. This wasn't a man begging for pity, this was a man who had done everything he could to protect his family, even if it meant humiliating himself by scavenging through garbage. Thomas felt a lump rise in his throat. He hadn't expected this. His entire life had been about winning in business, winning in negotiations, winning at all costs. He had built his empire on the backs of people like James, and yet, he had never once considered what their lives were like beyond the office walls. "How long has this been going on?" Thomas asked, his voice softer now. James shrugged, looking down at his hands. "A few months. I've tried to get help, but, my pride, I suppose. I didn't want to bother anyone with my problems." For a moment, Thomas was speechless. He had seen people in dire situations before, he had seen poverty, illness, and suffering, but never had it hit him so personally. Here was a man who had worked for him, quietly and diligently, for years, and Thomas had never once thought to ask about his life. Now, faced with the stark reality of James's struggle, Thomas felt something inside him shift. "Why didn't you come to me?" Thomas asked, though he knew the answer. He had never been the kind of boss who invited personal conversations. He was the CEO, aloof and distant, and people didn't come to him with their problems because they assumed, rightly, that he wouldn't care. James gave him a sad smile. "I didn't think it was your concern, sir. You have a company to run." Thomas leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. For the first time in a long time, he felt out of his depth. This wasn't a problem he could solve with money alone. It was bigger than that, it was about the system he had helped create, a system that rewarded people like him and left people like James struggling to survive. "I'm sorry," Thomas said finally, and the words felt foreign on his tongue. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially not to employees. But in this case, it felt necessary. James looked up, surprised. "For what, sir?" "For not noticing. For not seeing what was happening in your life," Thomas replied. "I've been so focused on my own world, my own success, that I never stopped to think about the people who helped make it all possible." There was a long silence, and then James nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir. But I don't need your pity. I just need to take care of my family." Thomas felt a strange mix of admiration and guilt. James didn't want charity, he wanted dignity. He wanted to be able to provide for his family without feeling like a failure. And in that moment, Thomas made a decision. The following week, Thomas called his board together for an emergency meeting. He proposed something radical, implementing a comprehensive employee support program at Grayson Enterprises. It would provide financial assistance for those facing medical emergencies, mental health support, and a living wage that would ensure no one under his employment would ever have to go hungry again. There was, of course, resistance from some of the board members. They argued that the company couldn't afford such an initiative, that it would cut into profits and make shareholders unhappy. But Thomas stood his ground. For the first time in his life, he wasn't thinking about the bottom line, he was thinking about the people behind the numbers. The program was implemented, and it quickly made a difference. Employees who had been struggling in silence, like James, now had access to the help they needed. Thomas began to hear stories from others, stories of sick family members, financial hardships, and personal struggles that had gone unnoticed for years. And with each story, Thomas felt the weight of his own privilege more heavily. But it wasn't enough for him. He couldn't shake the image of James picking through the trash, and he couldn't forget the shame in the man's eyes. Thomas wanted to do more, not just for his employees, but for the city, for people like James who had been left behind in the race for success. A year later, Thomas stood on the stage of a grand charity gala. The event had been organized to celebrate the launch of the Grayson Foundation, a new initiative that would provide housing, healthcare, and educational opportunities for low-income families across the city. Thomas had donated a significant portion of his fortune to get it started, and he had worked tirelessly to secure more funding from other wealthy donors. As he looked out at the crowd, Thomas felt a sense of purpose he had never felt before. This wasn't about making money anymore, it was about making a difference. And it had all started with one moment, one glimpse into the life of a man who had worked for him for years without complaint. James and his family were at the gala, seated at a table near the front. His wife had recovered, thanks to the medical care they had been able to afford with the help of the company's new support program. His children were healthy, and they no longer had to worry about where their next meal would come from. James had even been promoted, his hard work and dedication recognized by the company. As Thomas stepped off the stage, he caught James's eye. The two men shared a nod, a silent acknowledgement of everything that had changed. Thomas had learned a valuable lesson, one that had transformed him from a man obsessed with wealth to someone who understood the true value of compassion. And in that moment, Thomas knew that he would never forget the sight of James picking through the trash. It had been the catalyst for a change he hadn't known he needed, a change that had made him not only a better boss, but a better man. The end.